Everybody, welcome to part two of the lecture on public assistance programs. We're going to start off by going over the history of public assistance. Public assistance grew out of the idea of private philanthropy and charity rather than public aid, and a lot of this was done in mutual aid societies. If you guys have heard of the Kiwanis Club or the Moose Lodge, my family is Catholic, so the Knights of Columbus, those are all mutual aid societies. So when somebody's family member was sick, people would contribute. They also had early pensions, provided health care, and all of that was done inside of societies. Those societies really became overwhelmed when the Great Depression hit, which led to sort of a demand for more government intervention in public assistance. So there's also a difference in sort of how assistance is thought about. So indoor relief, so poorhouses, orphanages, mental hospitals, schools for the deaf, people generally agree that these things are good things. Now, outdoor relief, so providing money to people in poverty simply so that they will be in less poverty, is generally seen as bad. And we went over some of the myths that are involved in all of that, such as it's encouraging people to be lazy and be dependent on government. Um, and people generally believed that it should be funded by voluntary organizations that can provide a level of scrutiny to the participants and be able to determine who is worthy and who is unworthy. During the New Deal, ADC, which eventually became AFDC and eventually became TANF, grew out of the idea of mother's pensions. So what happens to a family after the father leaves and abandons the family or passes away or becomes disabled? So mother's pensions were designed for mothers whose job it was to work inside of the home and were unable to participate inside the labor market due to systemic sexism. It's really based on that traditional family model. The Depression meant that these local and private organizations tend to run out of money and were relying more extensively on state and local governments. So the New Deal was sort of a way to push all of that forward from a federal level. The New Deal authors weren't benevolent, though. They generally thought that cash assistance was bad and that the program was really temporary and for deserving mothers only. I won't bore you by reading all of this, although I really suggest that you do on your own time. You guys missed a really fun chapter in social work history and also a very ethically bad chapter in social work history, where part of benefits work was to determine whether or not a mother on TANF was having sex with another man who then might be able to take care of her kids. And then the state could stop paying that person benefits. And these were called man of the house rules, which were eventually struck down by the Supreme Court. So TANF used to be AFDC, so Aid to Families of Dependent Children. And like we said, it was intended to address the problem of families where the father had abandoned their kids and his wife. In 1962, we started mandating casework and treatment for people who are on AFDC. And over time, we sort of gradually liberalized the regulations about who could come into AFDC. There were welfare rights campaigns to try and get more and more and more people onto the welfare rolls to try and push us towards a system where we would actually provide a basic income. That was done by Piven and Cloward, who are kind of big names in social work. In the 1980s, we sort of went the opposite direction under Ronald Reagan. A lot of states, including Wisconsin, experimented with programs that mandated work and provided work training, job training, schooling for people on AFDC with the idea that you're trying to get people off of government assistance. And that really came to a head with AFDC essentially reaching about 5% of the entire US population in the 1990s. And that created the sort of ideological crisis that resulted in welfare reform. So the sort of main component of welfare reform is that aid to people in poverty is no longer an entitlement. People don't just get it. The government can restrict who gets it and who doesn't. And they imposed a number of restrictions on people who are applying for cash benefits through what is now TANF. That most famously, you have a 60-month time limit, so people can't receive benefits after 5 years of receiving them. There are exceptions for up to 20% of the caseloads. In Washington, D.C., where I worked, one of the exceptions was if you were HIV positive, that time limit did not apply to you. So states generally liked TANF. TANF was a way to cut their budgets a little bit, or cut the amount of spending that they had to do, because states only had to spend about 80% of what they were spending in the 1990s. And states were also taking over child support enforcement for families, which meant that they could potentially be spending even less by getting that money from the absent fathers inside of these families rather than paying it out from state taxes. Again, pretty famous for TANF, there are work requirements, which means that you have to start volunteering after 2 months. Within 24 months, you have to start working, and that states have to reach, although they've never done this, a 50% work participation rate, which means 50% of the people on TANF at any given time need to be working. Childcare assistance is a part of TANF, as we went over before, but it is not required that states pay for it. However, states cannot dismiss people simply because they couldn't find childcare and were therefore unable to work. States also have to develop plans to reduce single motherhood and reduce abortions. So we could again see this sort of using welfare policy to try and control women's sexuality and women's bodily autonomy. It also restricted immigrants from getting TANF benefits based on the idea that people come to the United States to get welfare benefits and mooch off of the government. It's not really something that happens. And then finally, it placed some restrictions on food stamps as well. So after welfare reform was passed, the welfare caseloads really declined. So about 60% of the people who were on them left. And for a little while, they left for the job market. The mid to late 90s were a boom time inside of the United States. And generally, people thought that the program was doing well. Once we hit the early 2000s, and then especially in the Great Recession of 2008 after the housing crash, we really saw how TANF wasn't an adequate safety net for people in poverty anymore. While we did provide more funds for people in poverty under TANF, we unfortunately really didn't see that many people being able to enter into TANF because of all of the restrictions that were placed on TANF. All of those work requirements, the requirement to comply with child support enforcement, and then just the meager benefits as well. So most TANF leavers, the people who are able to use TANF and get a job, end up remaining on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program or food stamps. So people who are able to leave TANF only make about $256 per week. And unfortunately, more than half the people who qualify don't end up claiming benefits for TANF. It's important to think about how we try to address poverty by thinking about the different types of poverty that there are. People who are in poverty for a shorter period of time are what are called the situationally poor. If you guys think about this as an onion, this would be the outer layer of the onion. So situationally poor, they have pretty high skills, they're able to be employed pretty easily, they're just the result of circumstances in poverty for a short period. Now, people who are in poverty for about 2 to 8 years, those are people who have limited employment options. They may have lower education, lower skills, and their employment, their ability to actually participate in the job market is really a larger function of the overall economy. Now, people who are on poverty for 8 or more years, those are people who have very low earning capacity. They have a lot of barriers to what is seen as the actual goal of public assistance, which is self-sufficiency, being able to work enough to support yourself. They may have drug abuse issues, health problems, trauma. Those people require a different sort of intervention. Those people require a lot more investment in services and supports for that population, and TANF isn't really going to cut it for them. It can provide them some amount of help, but they are going to be in poverty for a longer period of time under TANF. And you also have people who are severely disabled. They need some kind of income support program like SSI because there's just no way that they are going to participate inside of the job market. So speaking of SSI, SSI is actually the program that I have the most experience working in. Um, According to your book, it has 7.9 million people, about $48 billion in spending. SSI payments are also they're adjusted for inflation, which means that they retain their value over time. Remember, we talked about at the beginning of this lecture that your purchasing power, the value of the money that you do have, goes down a bit every single year. Well, supplemental security income corrects for that. It reaches people who are disabled. So the people that I worked with who had severe mental illnesses qualify for SSI, but also people who are elderly and in poverty, people who are blind, as well as those who are entering treatment. Been a significant growth in the number of people who are receiving SSI, especially after TANF was created. There is a link between people who used to be on TANF and are now moving towards SSI. Unfortunately, SSI does not pay very much. It pays closer to the poverty level, but still fairly well below it. The average payment is about $546 per month, and I actually updated that figure to be the 2016 figure. It also grew out of the idea of basic income. So basic income, as we've sort of talked about a little bit, is the idea that people should be paid just as a right of citizenship. They should be assured an absolute floor that that people can't go below. People didn't like that because there's an idea of the deserving poor versus the undeserving poor. So people who are lazy, people who just won't get a job, those people shouldn't get money. So instead, we have programs that are trying to fund the deserving poor. In this case, people who are disabled and people who are in poverty, who are elderly, who can't really participate inside of the job market. Unfortunately, SSI benefits also take a very long time to get approved. So oftentimes you are waiting more than a year through long appeals processes. And sort of the thinking behind this is that the government does this on purpose to reduce the amount of people who end up on SSI. Your book also talks about general assistance. General assistance programs are usually fairly small. They are operated on the local or state level, and they provide small amounts of money for people who don't really fit into any of the boxes like TANF or SNAP. They need a smaller amount of assistance for a small period of time. So there are a lot of trends that are important to note inside of public assistance. But as I look at the clock, it seems like I might need to go into another video here. So I'm going to stop it here, and we're going to do part 3 coming up.